Chapter 1. The Curtain. She whispered. Into the summer season at the Hotel Vérité was always an affair of quiet luxury, discreet wealth, polished marble, and the scent of lavender in the hallways. It stood atop the hills of Aix-en-Provence, like a serene sovereign, its balustrades flanked by cypress trees, and its manicured terraces descending into gardens where white peacocks wandered without fear. The guests who stayed here were not simply rich. They were refined, or at least wished to appear so. And the hotel, in turn, kept its secrets. On the afternoon of August 5th, the sun hung low over the vineyards like a golden coin dipped in honey. A chambermaid named Celeste Lemoine had knocked gently on the door of Suite 6B, an elegant corner room with floor-to-ceiling drapes and a grand view of the valley. No one answered. It was unusual. The suite was occupied by one Madame Violaine Chasseron, an actress of fading stardom but enduring elegance. Her return to the public eye had caused some stir recently. Her memoirs were scheduled for release that autumn, and whispers circled that they named names, dangerous ones. Madame Chasseron? Celeste tried again. Still no answer. She unlocked the door with a master key. At first, the room appeared empty. The white linen was untouched, the balcony doors ajar, letting in a soft Mistral breeze. But there was something unnatural about the silence, too profound, too deliberate. And then, from behind the velvet curtain came a whisper. Celeste froze. The sound was slight, barely more than breath, a hush more than a voice. She pulled back the curtain. There, crumpled on the floor, was Madame Chasseron. Her hand was tangled in the curtain folds, her face ghostly pale, her lips parted as if caught mid-sentence. Her body had not yet cooled. The scream that echoed through the hotel was enough to stop the pianiste mid-waltz. By early evening, the Hotel Vérité was locked in quiet panic. The guests, dressed in dinner jackets and silk shawls, had gathered in clusters, whispering in hallways, peering over balconies. The management tried to maintain order. Inspector Deveau from Marseille arrived by car at 6:30. He was a broad man with the sigh of someone who had spent too many years deciphering petty frauds and domestic tragedies, not murders in high-class resorts. He examined the room carefully. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing broken. A faint perfume still lingered, and a glass of water sat untouched on the writing desk. The curtain cord had been clenched in the dead woman's hand. The cause of death? Unknown. No wounds, no obvious toxins, not even a trace of violence. It could be natural, the inspector muttered, scratching his head. A heart attack, perhaps, or a seizure. But even he didn't believe it. Not fully. By nightfall, 4 guests had requested early departures. One of them, a man in his 30s with a shifty gaze and an Italian passport, left behind an empty suitcase and a torn photograph in the waste bin. Elsewhere in the hotel, a bellhop was delivering a telegram to the concierge's desk. It read, "To Hercule Poirot, London, regret to inform. Stop Violaine Chasseron found dead in room stop, no signs of forced entry. Stop, request your presence, immediately stop. Hotel Vérité, Aix-en-Provence. Inspector Deveau." 3 days later. The train from Calais arrived precisely on time. From the second-class compartment emerged a small, elegant man with an immaculately brushed mustache, a gray travel suit without a single crease, and a cane with a silver eagle's head. Hercule Poirot looked up at the sky, frowned at a passing cloud, and straightened his tie. His eyes, however, glinted with curiosity. At the hotel, a hush had fallen. Rumors of suicide had taken root, and with them came the more tantalizing whispers that Violaine had been afraid, that she had been seen speaking quietly into the curtain as if addressing someone hidden behind it. That she had burned a letter the night before. Poirot's arrival was met with quiet recognition by those who knew the weight of his name. He did not linger in the lobby. He walked the halls with purpose, pausing to glance at a scuff on the floor, to inspect the dust on a light fixture, to ask for a seating chart from the night of Madame Chasseron's final dinner. But it was not until he stepped into Suite 6B that he truly paused. The room had been kept untouched, per his request. The curtain still swayed slightly. Poirot stood, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the spot where the actress had fallen. He closed his eyes. "She whispered," he said softly, "and that means she believed someone was listening." His eyes opened. This was not a woman who spoke to herself. The stage was set. The suspects were still within the gilded cage of the hotel walls, and Poirot, with his little gray cells already beginning their silent work, would find the truth. Even if it was buried in whispers, concealed by curtains, and protected by fear. Chapter 2. The first clues. The next morning, the sky over Aix-en-Provence was the color of pewter, its overcast hush settling over the Hotel Vérité like a veil of mourning. Poirot stood in the center of Suite 6B, as precise and composed as if he had arrived to review theater seating, not the scene of a death. He observed everything. The symmetrical placement of the bedside lamps, the crease in the bedspread that did not match the others, the smudged fingerprint on the water glass left untouched on the escritoire. Inspector Deveau hovered nearby, clearly uneasy in Poirot's presence. "You see, Monsieur Poirot, there is no evidence of violence," Deveau said, gesturing vaguely. "No signs of forced entry, no medication, no suicide note. The post-mortem has yet to be completed, but preliminary reports suggest heart failure." "Ah, but of course," Poirot murmured, walking slowly around the room. "And yet Madame was not ill. Not according to the medical records her doctor in Paris provided. Fit as a swallow," he said. "If we are to assume heart failure, we must then ask, why? Why does a woman with no prior history of illness die quietly behind a curtain?" He paused at the window, where the heavy velvet still retained the faintest crease. Poirot reached out and gently touched the folds. Then he glanced down. There, nestled in the fringe at the hem of the curtain, was a delicate gold earring. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered, crouching to retrieve it with a handkerchief. "The left earring is still on the vanity. This one, however, she did not replace." "Why?" Deveau leaned closer. "Perhaps it fell during the struggle. But there is no evidence of a struggle, remember, mon ami," Poirot said with a faint smile. "We are told she died peacefully, are we not?" Poirot moved to the writing desk. A black lacquered fountain pen lay beside a hotel notepad. The top page had been torn off. Poirot picked up the pad and tilted it toward the light. With a pencil, he lightly shaded the top page. An imprint began to appear. Looping, feminine handwriting. "Il sait. Il était là. He knows. He was there." Poirot's eyes sharpened. A note. Written, then torn away. Left unposted. Why would Madame Chasseron write such a thing and not send it? "Could have been to herself," Deveau said with a shrug. "Or to someone she feared," Poirot countered. "And that makes a great difference." They continued their examination. In the bathroom cabinet, 3 tubes of lipstick, one of them uncapped, its tip slightly smeared. On the nightstand, a dog-eared copy of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, spine cracked at a particular chapter, the one in which a woman discovers betrayal in a letter never sent. Poirot took his time with the wardrobe. Everything was arranged with a kind of theatrical care, as if Madame Chasseron were forever preparing for an audience. Silks and chiffons, a single black velvet gown hanging at the far end like a shadow. But it was what Poirot found in the coat pocket of a traveling blazer that caught his attention. A small, folded photograph. It had been ripped clean through the middle, leaving only the right half intact. The image showed a younger Violaine with an arm around a man, only his hand and shoulder remained in frame. The rest had been torn away. Her face, however, told its own story. She was smiling, yes, but her eyes betrayed a distinct unease. The kind of smile one wears when the camera is watching, and escape is impossible. Poirot tucked the photograph into an envelope. Later that day, he descended into the drawing-room of the hotel where the remaining guests sat with cultivated boredom behind newspapers and teacups. The tension beneath their social graces was palpable. Every one smiled too much, spoke too softly. No one mentioned Madame Chasseron, and yet her absence rang louder than any piano note struck in the adjacent lounge. Poirot's gaze flicked from face to face. A man in horn-rimmed glasses flipping through Le Figaro, glancing up too often. A woman in pearls who stirred her tea mechanically, her gaze locked on the window, though her spoon clinked against the porcelain for far too long. An American businessman trying to look as though he understood none of the conversation around him, and doing it too well. A brunette in her 30s sitting very still, her lipstick perfect, her face blank. And then, a distinctive voice from behind. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume?" Poirot turned to find a woman in her 50s, tall, striking, with a deep voice that suggested cigarettes and stage lights. "I am Lucille Ferrand," she said. "I was Violaine's understudy for 3 years. Back in the Théâtre de Minuit days. I imagine I'll be of some interest to you." Poirot bowed. "Any friend of Madame Chasseron is of interest. You are most kind." Lucille tilted her head. "Friend?" she echoed. "That's a stretch." "Monsieur." Violaine didn't have friends. She had an audience. But yes, I knew her, perhaps better than anyone here. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then I hope you shall grant me a few minutes of your time. And tell me, did Madame seem disturbed of late?" Lucille leaned in, her voice low. She was terrified, not of death, mind you, of the past. Poirot said nothing, but as she turned away, he looked again at the guests in the room, and saw not strangers, but masks. Some shifting, some barely holding. The curtains whispered still, and Poirot knew the first act was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The salon at Hotel Verité had been rearranged at Poirot's request. The furniture, once loosely scattered in artful disarray, had been drawn into a circle, armchairs and low velvet seats forming a gentle arena. Poirot insisted it was merely for comfort, but those with sharp minds felt the subtle shift. A drawing-room became a stage, every guest an actor. By mid-afternoon, the remaining guests who had not fled were summoned, not with force, but with the strange magnetic pull of expectation. Inspector Deveau lingered in the background, trying not to fidget. Poirot stood at the head of the circle like a conductor before the first note. "I thank you all for your patience," Poirot began, fingers laced. "The unfortunate death of Madame Chasseron requires a most delicate approach. For now, we ask nothing more than your honesty and cooperation." Murmurs passed around the circle like a passing breeze. Poirot made no attempt to quell them. He simply nodded to a small man on his left and gestured politely. "Perhaps we may begin with introductions." The man adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat. "Gilbert Duvivier," he said. "I'm with the Ministry of Culture, on holiday. Madame Chasseron and I were Acquaintances in Paris, professionally. Poirot nodded. Merci, monsieur. Your room is 3C. The next to speak was the brunette Poirot had noted earlier, the one with the stillness that spoke volumes. Annabel Lee, she said. Her voice was low and exact. I'm an author. Violaine had agreed to let me ghostwrite her memoir. Several heads turned toward her. She did not react. She was worried, Annabel continued. She believed someone wanted to stop the book. She wouldn't say who, only that it involved something old, something buried. Poirot made a mental note. Room number 2A. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, said the next guest, a tall American with sandy hair and a blazer 2 shades too loud for the occasion. Name's Clark Hennessy. I met Violaine at dinner, that's all. Didn't know her before. She seemed nice. A little on edge. Poirot offered a gracious smile. You are here because you were present. That, monsieur, is enough. 4B, he added. The woman in pearls spoke next. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Odette Laframboise, she said. Widow. I once acted with Violaine years ago in Marseille. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, until 2 nights ago, when she left a note asking to speak with me privately. But she never came. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. May I see the note? Odette fumbled through her handbag and produced a small folded card. It read simply, Tonight, after dinner. Balcony Terrace. Come alone. The time was marked as 9:30 p.m., less than 2 hours before Violaine's body was discovered. She was trying to make peace, perhaps, Odette murmured. Poirot inclined his head, or to confess something. He looked toward the last 2 in the room. The man with horn-rimmed glasses was already halfway through lighting a cigarette. Remy Bardot, he said. I manage the actress's financial affairs. Had done for years. Poor Violaine. She was dramatic in life, and even more so in death. His gaze was hard, cautious. And you were here on business? She summoned me. Said there were changes to be made in her estate. I advised against publishing the memoirs naturally. She didn't listen. And your room? Suite 5D. The last woman, a statuesque lady with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of old nobility, spoke without prompting. Countess Elena Markova, she said. Her accent was Eastern European, her vowels shaped like knives. I was once a patron of the arts. Violaine and I, we had an arrangement. She borrowed money. She never repaid it. Her tone left no room for sentiment. Poirot's gaze lingered on her. You hold a grudge, madame? She looked away. I do not hold things. I let them rot. A silence fell. Poirot allowed it to settle. The threads had begun to show themselves. Money, secrets, promises made in private and broken in silence. After the guests dispersed, Poirot remained seated, fingers steepled. You see it, mon ami? He said to Inspector Deveau. Deveau leaned closer. They all knew her. They all feared her. Poirot's eyes rested on the empty chair where Violaine Chasseron would never sit again. One writes her memoirs. Another handles her finances. One lost money, another lost friendship. And one, I think, lost something else entirely. Deveau frowned. What's that? Poirot stood. Power, perhaps, or leverage. It depends on which version of Violaine Chasseron you believe in. That evening, Poirot walked alone through the garden paths behind the hotel. The cypresses whispered in the dusk breeze. Somewhere a nightingale sang. He paused near the stoned bench where the peacocks slept. Above, the windows of Suite 6B glowed faintly, the curtain swaying gently in the open window. So many eyes in that salon had shifted when names were spoken. So many lips trembled when they thought they were unseen. Poirot smiled faintly to himself. A circle of lies, carefully arranged. But it only takes one thread, pulled in the right direction. He tapped his temple, and the whole curtain comes down. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The following morning dawned cool and veiled in mist, softening the sharp stone edges of the Hotel Verité's architecture and cloaking the terraces in an almost ethereal quiet. A valet in white gloves waited respectfully by the entrance, as Hercule Poirot descended the marble stairs with the elegance of a man preparing not for breakfast, but for battle. He wore a dove-gray suit, pressed to perfection, and a carnation in his lapel, fresh from the garden. His mustache, as always, appeared immovable. Yet his eyes, those keen, unblinking eyes, were already observing the foyer as if it were a stage set for a play, in which he knew the ending, but not yet the order of scenes. "Monsieur Poirot," said Inspector Deveau, rising from a nearby armchair, "we've located the original torn page from the notepad." "Ah," Poirot beamed. "The message, he knows. He was there." She did not write it for herself. She wrote it for someone she trusted, or feared, and yet she tore it out and did not deliver it. It suggests hesitation or interruption. Deveau handed him the recovered paper. It had been crumpled and shoved behind the dresser, perhaps in panic or haste. Poirot examined it closely. She began to write, then changed her mind. This, too, is a clue. At mid-morning, Poirot convened his first private conversations with the suspects, preferring the intimacy of the conservatory, a sunlit space filled with the scent of jasmine and the occasional flutter of butterfly wings against glass. He began with Annabel Lee, the ghostwriter. She arrived in wide-legged trousers and a pressed blouse, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes, clear and calculating, betrayed nothing but polite professionalism. "You and Madame Chasseron were writing her memoirs," Poirot began. "Was there resistance? From others? From herself?" Annabel's expression did not waver. She was terrified of truth, Monsieur Poirot. Not because she couldn't face it, but because others couldn't. There were stories she wanted to tell, names she wanted to include. She claimed there had been a pact long ago, something dark, theatrical, absurd. A pact? Yes. She referred to it only once, said it had been made in a theater dressing room after a performance in Marseille, sometime in the early 90s. 4 people. She wouldn't say more. 4 people, Poirot repeated softly. And this pact, it was about what, exactly? Annabel hesitated. She said it was about who would take the blame if something happened. Poirot sat back. How very curious. Poirot's next appointment was with Gilbert Duvivier, the man from the Ministry of Culture. He arrived with the air of a man hoping his title might excuse his presence. Madame Chasseron was difficult, yes, Duvivier said, but her work had cultural merit. I merely advised on a possible revival of one of her plays. You advised her on her public future, Poirot said. Did you advise her privately as well? Duvivier stiffened. We weren't close. Poirot smiled thinly. But perhaps once you were. Duvivier did not answer. Later came Remy Bardot, the financial advisor, who spoke as if every word cost him effort. Violaine was reckless, he said. She hadn't paid her taxes properly in years. She owed several private lenders, including Markova. She was desperate for that book to bring her back into the limelight, and the money that comes with it. She was willing to name people, risk reputations, possibly even her own. She was willing to burn the whole theater down if it meant the spotlight would return to her, Bardo said coldly. That's what scared people. Scared you? Poirot asked, watching carefully. I didn't kill her, Bardo replied. Poirot didn't press. Not yet. The last conversation of the morning was with Countess Elena Markova. She walked into the conservatory like a queen into her throne room, resplendent in violet and silver, her eyes lined in precise black. She owed me 30,000 francs, Markova said. Violaine Chasseron borrowed money like it was perfume, sprayed lavishly, and then vanished. And you came here to collect? I came because she invited me, promised repayment, promised revelations. Poirot tilted his head. Did she hint at danger? She said only this: they won't let me finish the book. And you assumed she meant... I assumed she meant someone from the past. There are many, Monsieur Poirot. Theater is not only lights and applause. It is blood and mirrors. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, madame. You have a gift for metaphor. She rose without a smile. No, I have a memory. As the day wore on, Poirot retired to the terrace with a notebook and a single sugared coffee. Devoe joined him, weary from interviews with the hotel staff. The maid who found her confirms the curtain was closed tightly, Devoe said, yet someone had drawn it open when the police arrived. Poirot nodded, perhaps to check if she was truly dead. Or to retrieve something, perhaps even to whisper something back. Devoe frowned. You still believe someone was listening? Someone always listens, Poirot replied, even when they pretend not to. From the terrace, the sound of laughter echoed faintly. Poirot watched as Clark Hennessy, the American, shared a drink with Lucille Ferrand, the actress who had once understudied Violaine. Both smiled too often, their gestures too rehearsed. It is beginning to surface, mon ami, Poirot murmured. The true play has yet to begin, but already some actors forget their lines. Devoe looked puzzled. You mean they're slipping? Poirot finished his coffee and stood. I mean that beneath every performance lies the truth. But one must be patient. One must listen closely to what is not said as much as what is. He adjusted his cuffs. And tomorrow I shall listen with great care. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The following morning broke with the soft clatter of porcelain and the rustle of newspapers in the breakfast room of Hotel Verité. Outside, the Provençal mist had burned off, revealing golden sunlight draping the hills. Yet despite the pleasant weather, the mood within the hotel remained strained. Conversations were quieter, glances more guarded. Even the staff moved with heightened caution, as if the very walls might be listening. At a small round table set by the window, Hercule Poirot sipped his chocolate chaud, gaze sweeping the room behind lidded eyes. Today, he would begin his methodical examination of each guest, not simply for alibis or facts, but for contradictions, fear, and the faintest notes of guilt. His first subject arrived promptly at 9. Clark Hennessy looked distinctly uncomfortable in daylight. The American businessman had swapped his loud blazer for a linen shirt, but his boyish swagger remained. He greeted Poirot with a loose handshake and the restless energy of someone who had never sat still for long. I already told the inspector everything, Clark said as he sat. Indeed, monsieur, Poirot replied calmly, but you did not tell me. Clark chuckled, but it lacked warmth. All right, then. I met Violaine the night before she died. She joined my table at dinner. We chatted. Had a drink. That's it. Poirot studied him, And what did you speak of? Her book, mostly. She was passionate about it, said it would shake the theater world. She did not seem afraid. Clark hesitated. Maybe a little. She kept looking over her shoulder, said something like, "The curtain has ears," which I figured was a joke. You know, theater types. Poirot made a small note in his book. Did she name anyone who might have opposed her memoir? No names, Clark replied. But she said someone would kill the story before it breathes. I thought she meant a publisher. Poirot's eyes flickered up. Or perhaps she meant it more literally. Clark swallowed. Look, I barely knew her. I liked her, sure, but I didn't kill her. I wouldn't even know how. Poirot smiled gently. Sometimes, monsieur, one does not need to know how, only why. Clark blinked, unsure if it was a threat or philosophy. The next interview was with Odette Laframboise, the widow with trembling hands. She arrived with the grace of a woman trained in public etiquette, but eroded by private grief. "I still can't believe she's gone," Odette murmured, dabbing her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. Violaine and I had not spoken in years, not since the scandal. Poirot tilted his head. "Scandal, madame?" Odette gave a tiny nod. "Back when we performed in Marseille, there was an incident. A young woman in the troupe disappeared. Some whispered she'd run off. Others said, well, it was hushed up. Violaine never spoke of it again. And you? Poirot asked. I had no proof of anything. Only shadows. Her voice dropped. Violaine was not always kind, Monsieur Poirot. She could be cruel, especially when cornered. Poirot leaned forward. She left you a note. Inviting you to the balcony terrace? Yes, Odette confirmed. I went. I waited half an hour. She never came. You saw no one else? Odette shook her head. Only the American man walking toward the gardens. He nodded politely. That was all. Poirot nodded. Merci, madame. Your memory may prove clearer than shadows suggest. Lucille Ferrand, the actress, was next. She arrived in a wide-brimmed hat, her face perfectly powdered, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. I'll save you time, she said, settling into the chair. Violaine had enemies. Most of us were them. Yet you came to see her, Poirot said. Why? She exhaled smoke from a long silver cigarette holder. Because I wanted to see if she would go through with it. The book, the accusations. She threatened to name me once. Why? She thought I'd stolen a role from her. I hadn't, but in her mind, everything was betrayal, every smile, a threat. Poirot studied her carefully. And you did not fear exposure? Lucille smiled grimly. Darling, I've been exposed since 1978. She had no ammunition. But others? Yes. She was playing with fire. Poirot tapped the table lightly. Then someone, perhaps, decided to extinguish the flame. Lucille didn't answer. She simply removed her sunglasses and met his gaze. There's one thing you must understand, Monsieur Poirot. Violaine didn't whisper into the curtain because someone was listening. She whispered because she wanted someone to listen. Poirot bowed his head. An actress to the very end. Remy Bardot, the financial advisor, followed. He was tense, clipped, as if rehearsing each word in his mind before allowing it to leave his lips. She was reckless, he repeated, financially, personally. She owed money all over France and beyond. And yet, Poirot said, she was ready to release a memoir that might have regained her fortune. Remy's eyes narrowed. Or destroyed what little remained. Not just hers, others, including mine. Poirot raised a brow. Yours. Remy leaned forward, voice low. She knew things. About embezzlement in the theater company, about who funded what, about how certain benefactors were repaid. Scandalous, Poirot said softly. Illegal, Remy replied. She didn't understand that once you write something down, it can be traced. Even fiction has fingerprints. Poirot nodded slowly. And were you afraid of being named? Remy stood abruptly. I was afraid of nothing. She's dead now. Isn't that enough? Poirot watched him go, fingers lightly tapping the notebook. The final interview before lunch was with Annabel Lee, once again composed and poised. I spoke to her the night before, she said. After dinner, she gave me a new chapter, one I hadn't seen before. Poirot leaned forward. Do you have it? Annabel retrieved a single typewritten page from her bag. Poirot read it carefully. It described, in veiled and poetic terms, a death behind a curtain, a woman collapsing while the other watched, hidden, unmoving. He looked up. A confession? Or a dramatization, Annabel said. It's hard to tell with her, but it felt real, too detailed. Poirot stared at the page, then back at Annabel. Was this a memory? She didn't answer. As the sun climbed to its peak, Poirot returned to his suite. He laid the notes out before him. Names, details, fragments. Everyone had a motive. And now, one new mystery emerged. A second curtain. A second death, long ago, whispered between pages and rehearsed in the shadows. Poirot stood by the window, looking out toward the garden where Violaine once stood. He touched the edge of the curtain. This time, he whispered, we shall not let the ending be written in silence. Chapter 6. First False Lead. The afternoon sun gilded the veranda with lazy shadows as Poirot reviewed his notes alone in the reading room. Each suspect's words ran in parallel columns across his notebook. Carefully annotated contradictions, timelines, repeated phrases. But it was not what they had said that most intrigued him. It was what each had chosen not to say. And yet, just as the fog of confusion thickened, a revelation broke through the mist. It came from the most unexpected corner. A chambermaid named Delphine, no older than 20, who approached Inspector Deveau that afternoon with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. I didn't know if it mattered, she stammered, glancing around. But I saw someone. Deveau narrowed his eyes. When? Just after midnight. The night Madame Chasseron died. I was coming back from the laundry corridor. I wasn't supposed to be on that floor. I'd lost my passkey. And who did you see? Delphine swallowed. Mr. Hennessy, the American. He was standing outside her room. Suite 6B? She nodded vigorously. He had his hand on the doorknob. He looked startled when he saw me. Said he'd gotten lost, was looking for ice. But the ice machine is on the floor below. Deveau shared the information with Poirot that same hour. And you believe her? Poirot asked, eyes narrowing. I do, said the inspector. She seemed shaken. And why lie? She has nothing to gain. Poirot tapped his fingers against the arm of the chair. No, but others do. That evening, Clark Hennessy was invited to speak with Poirot once more, though this time the tone of the invitation was less casual and more interrogative. He arrived in rolled sleeves, clearly annoyed. Back again, huh? Didn't know I was that fascinating. Poirot gestured politely to the armchair opposite him. You were seen outside Madame Chasseron's suite, monsieur. At midnight, the very night she died. Clark blinked. That's not true. Poirot did not move. A member of staff saw you. You told her you were looking for ice. But alas, the ice machine is on the lower floor. The American's face colored. All right. I wasn't looking for ice. Then what were you looking for? Clark hesitated. A friend. Madame Chasseron? No, he said too quickly. Lucille, the actress. She invited me for a drink. Poirot tilted his head. She stays in 6D, at the opposite end of the hall, and yet you were outside 6B. Clark's jaw tightened. I got the numbers confused. Did you enter the room? No. Did you hear anything? Clark stood abruptly. I didn't kill her, for God's sake. Poirot's voice remained soft. But you lied. And lies, monsieur, are like thread. When pulled, they unravel everything. Clark walked out moments later, face pale, hands clenched. Poirot did not follow. Word of the accusation spread through the hotel by morning. Hushed voices in hallways, glances exchanged behind coffee cups. The guests, once eager to appear cooperative, began to close ranks. Lucille Ferrand confronted Poirot on the terrace. "Clark?" she asked, voice edged with scorn. He wouldn't have had the subtlety to poison a cup of tea, let alone stage a scene behind velvet curtains. Poirot considered her. He did lie. Because he's foolish, not guilty. Foolishness often invites guilt's company. She leaned in. If you think this will end with an American being dragged away, you don't understand Violaine. Then enlighten me, madame. Lucille's gaze grew distant. She was never a victim. She thrived in danger, played it like a violin. Poirot remained quiet. But in his mind, something clicked. Inspector Deveau, meanwhile, had seized upon the new lead with enthusiasm. He arranged a formal questioning with Clark and requested the hotel porter provide access to all surveillance logs and keycard records, of which there were few, as the hotel prided itself on discretion over technology. Still, the electronic lock of Suite 6B did record one peculiar detail. It had not been opened at all after 10:40 p.m. the night of the murder. And Clark, though caught in a lie, had no traceable access to the room. He had not entered, at least not through the door. Poirot stood at the threshold of Suite 6B, frowning. He examined the frame. No scratches, no tampering. And then he moved toward the balcony. The wind was strong that night, witnesses had said. But the potted plants on the railing had not tipped. The curtain had swayed, yes, but the latch on the French doors remained firm. No intrusion from the outside. And still, the feeling gnawed at Poirot. She was not alone, he murmured, and yet no one entered. Curious, n'est-ce pas? Poirot returned to his suite, reviewing the torn photograph once more. Violaine's hand on the shoulder of the man whose face had been ripped away, her expression, part amusement, part discomfort. He studied the photo's edge, faint smudges, as though the photo had been touched often, folded, unfolded, carried, perhaps, by someone uncertain whether to destroy it or keep it. Suddenly, Poirot stood. He walked briskly down the hall to room 3C, Gilbert Duvivier's suite. The man opened the door in his dressing gown, surprised. "Monsieur Poirot." Poirot held up the photograph. "This is you, is it not?" Duvivier's eyes darted to the photo. Just a shoulder, a familiar hand. He hesitated. Yes, it is. Why tear it?" "I didn't." He lied. Poirot's voice grew colder. "You lied about the nature of your relationship. You were not acquaintances. You were lovers." "Perhaps more." Duvivier flushed. It was long ago. Before her fame. It ended badly. "Ended, monsieur? Or was it buried?" Duvivier said nothing. That night, Poirot returned to the conservatory. He sat alone among the orchids, watching the last light fade behind the glass. Clark Hennessy had been the obvious choice, the brash foreigner with something to hide. But, as with most performances, the first act existed to mislead. The true play, Poirot knew, was only just beginning. Beneath the velvet curtain of memory, another figure waited, still unseen, still listening. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. A heavy stillness settled over Hotel Verité the next morning, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Gone was the superficial calm that had once graced the breakfast lounge. In its place, taut silences, forced smiles, and watchful eyes. The guests had begun to turn inward, retreating behind polished manners and muttered phrases. Hercule Poirot, however, thrived in such silence, for in quiet one could listen deeply. And he knew now that the next step in the dance was not to ask, but to press, not with accusation, but with subtle provocation. Truth, when approached directly, concealed itself. But when the room grew comfortable, truth, like guilt, would begin to speak of its own accord. At precisely 10 a.m., Poirot entered the hotel's private salon, now his chosen arena. He had summoned Remy Bardot to speak first, not because the man was his strongest suspect, but because he was brittle, and brittle men, Poirot knew, cracked under their own weight. Remy arrived in a gray suit far too fine for the heat, his collar stiff, his voice clipped. "Again?" he asked. Poirot motioned politely. "Please, monsieur, sit. I promise you, this shall be different." Remy sat with reluctance. Poirot folded his hands. "You once advised Madame Chasseron not to publish her memoir. You feared the revelations within." "I feared litigation," Remy replied coolly. "She was reckless with her accusations." "And what of the chapter she delivered to Annabel Lee the night before her death? Have you read it?" "I've heard of it." Poirot produced the single page, sliding it across the table. "She describes a woman dying behind a curtain, watched by another who remains hidden. Does it sound familiar?" Remy did not touch the page. "She was writing fiction, but inspired by truth." Remy said nothing. Poirot smiled faintly. "You were there that night, Remy, not the night Violaine died, but the one she wrote of, in Marseille, the dressing room, the pact." A vein in Remy's temple twitched. "You see, monsieur," Poirot continued, "Violaine wasn't whispering to herself. She was whispering to someone she once trusted, someone who had betrayed her long ago." Remy stood. "This is ridiculous." "Then prove it," Poirot said gently. "Tell me what happened that night in Marseille, because I assure you, if you don't, someone else will." But Remy walked out in silence, the door clicking shut like the end of a scene poorly played. Poirot's second conversation was with Annabel Lee, who arrived with the composure of a woman who rehearsed her responses like monologues. "You read the chapter to the end?" Poirot asked. "I did." "And yet you did not bring it to the authorities." Annabel raised an eyebrow. "There is no law against dramatizing one's past, Monsieur Poirot. But this was not merely dramatization, it was memory." "She never said that. She did not need to. You knew." Annabel remained still. Poirot leaned closer. "You once said she was afraid of the past, but I believe it was you who feared what she would remember, and commit to ink." Her facade cracked then, just slightly, a flicker in the eyes, a pause in breath. "You think I killed her?" Poirot smiled. "No, not yet." That afternoon, Poirot took his tea on the garden terrace, knowing full well that Lucille Ferrand would join him. And indeed, she appeared, no invitation necessary, carrying a cigarette in one hand and her silence in the other. "You've stirred the nest," she said, sitting without asking. "Remy's been pacing the halls. Annabel looks like she's seen a ghost. You must be pleased." "Not pleased," Poirot replied. "Merely observant." Lucille watched him. "You're close to something." "I am close to something old," he said. "Something buried beneath theater dust and curtain folds. Violaine did not die from fear. She died because someone feared what she might say." Lucille exhaled smoke. "Everyone's afraid of something. Even you, madame." She did not answer. Poirot turned toward her. "What happened to Sylvie Marat?" Lucille froze. Poirot's voice softened. "She was the young actress who disappeared in Marseille. The scandal that was never spoken of. Violaine hinted at it in her manuscript. Sylvie never ran away, did she?" Lucille stared straight ahead. "It was a long time ago." Poirot nodded. And yet Violaine remembered. She planned to name those who were present. "She never said that." "But you knew," Poirot said, echoing his earlier line, "because you were there." A beat of silence. "She fell," Lucille said at last. "No one pushed her. No one planned it. But the way she landed, it was awful." "And she didn't move." Poirot said nothing. "She hit the mirror," Lucille continued. "Shards everywhere. Violaine panicked. Bardot was drunk. Gilbert ran. I froze." Poirot's voice was gentle. "And the pact? Not to tell. Not to say a word. Ever. It was Remy's idea. Violaine agreed. We all agreed." Poirot looked at her. "Until Violaine broke the pact. With her pen." Lucille turned her face away. She said the past needed to be confronted, but none of us wanted to. We built lives on forgetting. Poirot rose slowly, and someone, madame, was willing to kill to keep it forgotten. By sunset, Poirot stood again in Suite 6B. He closed the door behind him and walked toward the curtain where Violaine had fallen. He touched the fabric. "She whispered not to a ghost," he murmured, "but to someone she believed would understand, would protect her, or warn her." Then he turned toward the desk. There, between the pages of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, he had tucked the torn photo earlier that day. He opened the book and found the photograph missing. Poirot's lips thinned. Someone had returned for it, and someone was beginning to break. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. It was just past midnight when the cry rang out through the west wing of Hotel Verité, a sharp, cracking note of alarm that shattered the hush of the corridors. Poirot had not been asleep. He rarely succumbed to rest during the heat of an unfolding puzzle. He had been reviewing his notes, standing beside his open window, when the scream arrived like a cold slap to the night. By the time he stepped into the hallway, a small crowd had gathered outside room 2A, Annabel Lee's suite. Inspector Deveau emerged first, still buttoning his coat. "She's all right," he said to the onlookers. "No one injured. Back to your rooms, please." But Poirot caught the flicker of something deeper behind the inspector's professional calm. Annabel, now wrapped in a hotel robe, was sitting on the edge of her bed, pale and visibly shaking. A maid stood behind her holding a cup of water. Deveau turned as Poirot entered. "You may want to see this." The writing desk had been overturned, the floor littered with pages torn and scattered. The curtains had been pulled violently aside, and the lamp on the nightstand was smashed. But the real damage lay on the bed. A black envelope, sealed with wax, had been left upon her pillow. Poirot stepped forward carefully. "You did not place this here yourself." Annabel shook her head. I was out walking the terrace before bed. When I came back, the door was ajar. This was here." Poirot examined the wax. It bore no crest or monogram, just a crude smear, hardened quickly. Inside, a single typed page. "If you open your mouth again, you will die the same way she did." Poirot read the line aloud. his voice cool and measured. He turned to Devoe. "There is no doubt now, mon ami. This was no isolated tragedy. The killer remains among us, and wishes very much to keep the past in silence." In the morning light, the damage appeared more theatrical than threatening, but the message had done its work. Annabel, usually poised and deliberate, was now jumpy, her sentences clipped, her glances evasive. Poirot joined her for breakfast on the terrace, where she sipped coffee with trembling hands. "Someone entered your room without force," he said. Meaning they had a key, or were let in. Annabel kept her eyes on her cup. "It's possible, but I locked the door. I always do. And you were gone how long? 15 minutes, perhaps. I needed air." Poirot nodded slowly. "Why were you targeted, mademoiselle? Why you and not another?" "Because I have her words," she whispered. "That chapter she gave me, it wasn't the only one. She left me more, said they were dangerous. I haven't shown anyone yet." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Where are they?" "In the lining of my suitcase. Hidden." Poirot leaned in. "May I see them?" Annabel hesitated, then stood. "Come to my room in 1 hour. I'll retrieve them." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, mademoiselle. But I urge you not to leave them unguarded. Whoever left that note knows they exist." An hour later, Poirot knocked on the door of room 2A. No answer. He knocked again. Still no answer. Just as he reached for the doorknob, the lock clicked from the inside. The door opened a fraction, and Annabel peered out. Her face was pale, eyes darting behind him. Poirot stepped inside quickly. The curtains were now drawn tight. The mirror on the far wall had been covered with a towel. "I didn't sleep," she said. "I kept seeing her, Violaine, in that same position." She produced a folder from her suitcase. Inside, 5 neatly typed pages. Poirot scanned them quickly. The first 2 described a theater dressing room. The third introduced a character unmistakably modeled after Countess Elena Markova. The fourth referenced a financial transaction gone awry, matching details Remy Bardot had refused to confirm. And the final page ended mid-sentence. "I watched her fall. I told myself it wasn't murder. But I knew in my gut, in my throat, that the curtain was not thick enough to keep me from hearing what she didn't scream." Poirot set the papers down carefully. "She was writing her own indictment," he said. "Not only of the others, but of herself." Annabel folded her arms. She wanted me to understand something. That the truth wouldn't just hurt them, it would destroy her. By noon, Poirot had requested a private audience with Countess Elena Markova. She arrived with a fresh coat of perfume and her signature disdain. "Do you believe in ghosts, madame?" Poirot asked her. "I believe in reputation," she said flatly, "and Violaine's ghost is doing a fine job of ruining mine. She wrote about you. Not by name, but by deed. She always did love a dramatic pen." Poirot leaned forward. "Were you in Marseille, madame, the night Sylvie Marat disappeared?" Markova's mouth drew into a tight line. "I have nothing to say about that." "But you were there." "I was." "Then you know what happened." "I know what people say happened." Poirot nodded. "But more importantly, you knew what Violaine was about to reveal, and you returned to the hotel not for repayment, but to stop her." Markova stood abruptly. "Your line of questioning is grotesque." Poirot stood with her. "And yet it is closer to the truth than anyone else dares go." She left without responding. Poirot did not follow. That evening, Poirot sat with Inspector Devoe once more in the garden alcove, reviewing the threatening note. No prints, Devoe said. "No fibers, clean as glass." Poirot turned the paper in his hand. "It's not the physical note that matters. It is the panic it provoked. Someone hoped to frighten Annabel into silence, but fear has the opposite effect on the truly clever." Devoe frowned. "You think she knows more?" "I think she knows enough, but not yet what it means." He stood, glancing up at the lights in the West Wing windows. "We are not hunting one crime," he said softly. "We are hunting two, one buried in memory, the other fresh and bloodless. Both are tied together. Like the folds of a curtain hiding something no one wishes to see. Somewhere in the darkened corridor, behind one of those doors, the person who had listened behind the velvet all those years ago was listening still, and the fear that had once belonged to Violaine Chasseron now belonged to the others." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Late afternoon found Poirot in the drawing-room, where the windows opened onto the olive groves, and the long shadows of cypress trees painted the walls in streaks of shadow and light. Outside, guests wandered with feigned idleness, but inside, tension had settled like dust, fine and inescapable. Poirot sat alone, notebook in hand, the threatening letter to Annabel folded neatly beside his teacup. He wasn't rereading it. He was waiting. And then, as he had anticipated, Gilbert Duvivier entered. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, hesitating by the door, "I believe we should speak." Poirot gestured calmly to the seat across from him. Gilbert's eyes darted once toward the terrace before he sat. "I heard about the letter," he said, "and about the missing chapters. It's clear now that this, whatever this is not finished." "No," Poirot agreed, "it is very much not finished. In fact, Monsieur Duvivier, I believe it has only just begun." Gilbert exhaled. "I don't want to be a part of this." "But you already are." "I didn't kill her," he said, voice rising slightly. "No," Poirot replied, "but you helped silence the truth once, and perhaps someone believes you will do so again." Gilbert stared. "You think I'm being blackmailed?" "No," Poirot said. "I think you are being warned, just as Annabel was. You were part of the pact, were you not?" A pause, a flicker of resistance. Then Gilbert dropped his eyes. "Yes, it had been 25 years ago." Marseille, the Théâtre de Minuit, a cramped dressing room, an after-party, a confrontation. Sylvie Marat, a young understudy, had threatened to reveal a private affair between her and the theater's wealthy patron, a married man. Violaine was furious. The others, Lucille, Remy, Gilbert, and even Markova, had all been in the room. Words were exchanged. Alcohol flowed. Sylvie slipped or was pushed. Gilbert couldn't say. She struck her head on the edge of the wardrobe mirror and collapsed. The others froze. Violaine whispered, "We make it go away." And they did. Sylvie was quietly taken from the theater by Remy and a porter loyal to Markova. Her body was left near the sea. The papers claimed she had drowned. The police never investigated. "I was 22, Gilbert whispered. "I didn't know what to do. I should have gone to the police, but I was afraid. We all were." Poirot's eyes did not blink. "And when Violaine began to write her memoirs, she said it would be fiction," Gilbert said. "But I saw the manuscript. It wasn't fiction. It was confession, which terrified you." "Yes, and not just me. Everyone she named was in this hotel last week. All of them. Every single one." Poirot closed his notebook softly. "You are not the killer, monsieur," he said. "But someone in this circle believes that story is worth killing for." Poirot knew the time had come to test the bonds between the others, not by confrontation, but by exposure. That evening, he arranged a subtle dinner gathering on the south veranda. Nothing official, nothing declared. Merely a coincidence of shared timing. But the seats had been chosen with precision. The wine poured carefully. The setting, among olive trees and fireflies, felt almost idyllic, until the talk turned, as Poirot intended, to memory. "You know," he said casually to the group, "I was thinking about Marseille. The old theater there. Closed down now, isn't it?" Lucille stiffened. Remy's fork halted midair. Even the Countess's painted expression flickered. "I passed through the city recently," Poirot went on, watching them each in turn. "Such a romantic place. So many stories buried there." No one replied. Annabel, seated to his left, sensed the shift and sipped her water in silence. Poirot smiled faintly. "You all knew Violaine in her youth. You knew her when she was just becoming Violaine Chasseron. I imagine those years left quite the impression." Still, no one responded. So Poirot leaned back and delivered the final seed. Her memoir, you know, named names. A beat of silence. Then Countess Markova dabbed at her lips with a linen napkin. "Names are wind, Monsieur Poirot. Anyone can write them." Lucille muttered, "And anyone can lie." But Remy's voice cut through the others. "Anyone can be buried, too." The air turned sharp. Poirot stood. "Forgive me, mes amis. I fear I have ruined the mood." But he was smiling as he left. The tension had fractured the facade. And fractures, Poirot knew, revealed the foundations beneath. That night, Annabel slipped a note beneath Poirot's door. "There's something in Remy's suite. A red folder. He mentioned it once while drunk. I think it's her final edits." Poirot waited until dawn before making his move. At 5:15 a.m., while the corridors were still in the hush of morning, Poirot visited Suite 5D. The door was unlocked, an error Remy would come to regret. Inside, the desk drawers were orderly, save for the lowest one. It was locked. Poirot used a thin tool from his cane to lift the mechanism. Inside, he found it. A red leather folder. Inside that, pages, typed, unedited, some marked in blue ink. Violaine's final words. Possibly her real account of Sylvie's death structured as a chapter never submitted to Annabel. Poirot's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. But it was not the text that caught his attention. It was the final sheet. It was blank. Except for one line, written by hand. "I know who didn't push her, and I know who stood still." By sunrise, Poirot stood again in Suite 6B. The curtain moved gently in the breeze. He had seen enough. One of them had stood still that night in Marseille. And now, one of them had killed not out of panic, but out of calculation, and he, Hercule Poirot, had only one more thread to pull before the curtain came crashing down. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The light of early morning spilled across the tiled floors of Hotel Verité in streaks of pale gold. Guests stirred slowly, their conversations hushed, their glances sharpened with suspicion. The murder of Violaine Chasseron no longer felt like a tragic accident from days past. It had become a storm that refused to pass, a living presence threading its way through each hallway and room. But Hercule Poirot moved through this quiet chaos with the poise of a man already standing at the eye of it. For while the others flinched at shadows and whispered behind teacups, Poirot had seen something they had not. A single detail. So small, it had almost escaped him. That morning, instead of descending for breakfast, Poirot returned to Suite 6B once more, alone. He closed the door behind him, breathed in the stale perfume that still clung to the curtains, and crossed the room with the precise footsteps of a man revisiting a memory. He stood in front of the writing desk, where he had first seen the torn note, Il sait. Il était là. He knows. He was there. Then, slowly, Poirot knelt. There, on the floor, just beneath the edge of the desk, was the discarded stub of a matchstick, barely visible between the floorboards. Not a match from the hotel's branded matchbooks, but a narrow, red-tipped variety favored by certain European brands, an unusual item to be found in the non-smoking suite of a famously vain actress who detested smoke. Poirot retrieved it with a gloved hand and slipped it into an envelope. He had seen this type of match once before, on the terrace ashtray outside Lucille Ferrand's room. Poirot did not confront Lucille. Not yet. Timing, he believed, was everything. He tucked the match into his pocket and turned instead toward a different clue, one that had haunted him since the day of Violene's death, the position of her body. She had fallen behind the curtain, one hand twisted in the fabric, her head tilted sharply, no bruising, no signs of a fall or visible trauma. The glass of water had been untouched. Her earring, one of them, was missing. A single detail, discarded and irrelevant to others. But not to Poirot, because Violaine was found kneeling, as if she had collapsed from within, not fallen from a height. No signs of thrashing or resistance, and the missing earring, found days ago, tangled in the fringe of the curtain's hem. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He crossed to the curtain, running a hand once more along its lining, a heavy velvet drape, backed in silk, yet it hung unusually tight in one place, near the hem where the earring had been found. He tugged gently, a faint, metallic click. Poirot stepped back, eyebrows lifting. A hidden pocket, stitched into the lining. Inside, a small glass vial, empty. Poirot turned it in the light. A scent clung to the lip, floral at first, then bitter. He recognized it at once. Laudanum, a heavy sedative, often used in the past as a painkiller, dangerous in excess, lethal if swallowed alone in a high dose. Violaine had not been poisoned with something theatrical. She had been coaxed. Poirot stepped away from the curtain and smiled coldly to himself. The theater had returned full circle. Later that day, Poirot joined Inspector Deveau in the lounge, handing him both the matchstick and the vial in silence. Deveau raised an eyebrow. Laudanum? Oui, Poirot replied. And a theatrical one at that. No needle, no glass on the floor, no smell in the water glass. Violaine did not ingest it by accident. She was drugged before her death. No, Poirot said. She was persuaded. Or, rather, manipulated. You see, someone had told her she was in danger, that she should hide, be cautious. Someone had encouraged her to sleep with one eye open, and then offered her just enough courage to sleep at all. Deveau frowned, a sedative disguised as a kindness. Precisely. The killer knew Violaine would fear for her safety. They knew how to offer a solution without raising suspicion. And then they waited, until she had dosed herself. And as the curtain closed, so did her consciousness. Deveau sat back stunned. She poisoned herself. She was led to do so. A manipulation, not a murder of force, but one of psychology. A method perfected not by rage, but calculation. Poirot stood, and that narrows our suspects. That evening, Poirot observed the salon again. Guests lounging in velvet chairs, drinks in hand, nerves fraying beneath polite conversation. He noticed Lucille Ferrand watching Remy Bardot. He noticed Annabelle keeping her back to the wall. he noticed Countess Markova saying nothing at all, and then his gaze returned to Lucille, elegant, controlled, always watching. The red-tipped matches had been hers, the only known smoker in the group, the only one who had shared tea with Violaine in the days before her death. A small detail she had offered freely, as if it had meant nothing, but the tea had been brought up by room service, ordered on Lucille's behalf. And the tea, Poirot now believed, had been laced. Back in his room, Poirot wrote a single sentence in his notebook and underlined it twice. She died while preparing for a scene that had no audience. Then, below it, he added, only the director would know how the play should end. Now, with his key clue in hand, the method of manipulation, Poirot had everything he needed to reconstruct the sequence. Violaine had feared someone, that someone had encouraged her to sedate herself, that someone had known about the pact, had been there when Sylvie fell. That someone knew exactly where Violaine would be the moment the laudanum took hold, and had stood behind the curtain with her, listening once again in silence. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The play was over. The curtain was ready to rise, and the final act had begun. Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. A storm gathered, not in the skies above Hotel Verité, but within its walls. Though the Provençal sun continued to shine outside, the atmosphere within the old estate was electric with unease. Guests spoke in clipped tones, avoiding eye contact, their cordiality thinning like brittle lace. Rumors moved faster than truth. Eyes lingered on Lucille Ferrand longer than before. Silence no longer felt polite. It felt strategic. And Hercule Poirot, the quiet conductor of this rising tension, did nothing to dispel it. Instead, he let the pressure mount. Let them feel it. Let them turn on each other. He waited until late morning to convene a quiet but pointed gathering in the smaller salon, a circular room with tapestries depicting scenes from classic tragedies, each face in the woven images locked in a permanent expression of dread. Poirot stood at the center of the room as the suspects arrived, one by one, like summoned actors unsure of which act they'd entered. Lucille arrived first, cool and composed. Then Annabel, who hovered near the doorway as if unsure whether to sit or flee. Gilberte entered next, followed by Remy Bardot, whose face was drawn with the exhaustion of a man one accusation away from collapse. Finally, Countess Elena Markova swept in like a last gust of cold wind, taking her seat with slow, deliberate elegance. Poirot closed the door. "I believe we are ready," he said quietly. "I have reason to believe," Poirot began, "that Madame Chasseron was not murdered in the traditional sense. She was not struck, stabbed, or strangled. There are no bruises, no cuts, no poison in the glass. Yet she did not die naturally." The group said nothing. Poirot looked to Lucille. She died after ingesting laudanum, an old-fashioned sedative. Not enough to kill most, but in Violaine's weakened, frightened state, it proved fatal. Lucille said nothing. Her hands remained folded. "She took it herself," Poirot continued, "but not without influence. Someone gave it to her. Someone offered it gently, as a solution to her fear. Not out of kindness, but calculation." Now Remy shifted in his chair. "And you think you know who?" Poirot's eyes flicked to him. "I do, but more importantly, I now know why." He paced slowly. Everyone in this room had a reason to fear what Violaine was writing. Her memoir was not a confession. It was an indictment. She intended to reveal a secret buried for 25 years. Poirot's voice sharpened. "The death of Sylvie Marat." Annabel flinched. Lucille looked down. Poirot stopped walking, Each of you played a part in hiding what happened, whether through action or silence. You stood in that dressing room and chose reputation over truth. The silence thickened. I do not judge that decision, Poirot said, but I do say this. Someone among you feared Violaine would no longer keep that secret, and that someone decided she must not speak. Gilbert's voice broke the silence. You're saying we're all suspects? Poirot nodded. Not suspects, Monsieur Duvivier. Witnesses. And one of you, a killer. What followed next was not questioning, but unraveling. Lucille turned first, her voice flat but razor-sharp. If you're implying I gave her laudanum, say so, Poirot. But know this, Violaine trusted me. I may have given her tea, but not poison. But you smoke, Poirot said calmly, and the matchstick found in her suite match those you use. That, madame, puts you there, quietly, carefully. She invited me that night, Lucille snapped. She wanted to rehearse the chapter aloud. Annabel stirred. What chapter? Lucille's eyes flicked to her. The one you're now clutching like a dagger. Poirot raised a hand. Let us not leap to blame. Yet understand, someone left a threat on Mademoiselle Lee's pillow. Someone stole the final chapter Violaine had written, and someone attempted to destroy her words, even after her death. All eyes turned to Remy. He shook his head slowly. I kept the chapter hidden because it was a mess of accusations. Vague, theatrical. I didn't know if it was true. Or because you knew it was, Annabel whispered. I didn't kill her, he barked. Poirot stepped in. But you benefited from her silence. Remy stood. So did all of us. There was a beat, just long enough for the words to land. Poirot let it sit, then said softly, and now the silence is breaking. Later that afternoon, Poirot walked alone through the courtyard. A peacock flared its tail before him as if sensing the shift. The truth had cracked through their performance, splitting alliances that had held for decades. He found Countess Markova seated by the fountain, eyes on the water. You orchestrate quite the spectacle, monsieur, she said without turning. I do not orchestrate, madame. I listen, and the dissonance reveals itself. She looked at him now, her expression unreadable. Violaine was always the loudest, and yet she died whispering. Markova gave a bitter smile. She always wanted the final word. Even now, she might get it. Poirot met her eyes. Not if her murderer gets it first. That night, there was a knock at Poirot's door. Annabel entered clutching a page in her hand. I found this, she said, in the sleeve of my coat. I swear I didn't put it there. Poirot took the paper. It was the missing page from Violaine's memoir, typed, unedited. It read, She didn't fall, she didn't trip, she reached for help, and the hand never came. I know, because I watched from behind the curtain. I was afraid then, but now I must speak, before I am silenced again. Poirot looked up. The curtain had become a symbol of guilt, of stillness, of one hand not reaching, and now the play was near its final act. Chapter 12. The confrontation. A quiet rain had begun to fall over Hotel Verité, softening the view from the salon windows and blurring the stone balustrades into shapes that felt half-remembered. The sound of it, gentle, persistent, was the only thing that filled the air as Hercule Poirot prepared for what would come next. The page Annabel had brought him the night before now rested on the table beside him, weighted with a brass letter opener. The typewritten lines swam again before his eyes, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. The truth was now complete, or nearly so. But he could not move too soon. Timing, always timing. He waited until late morning. Then he asked for Lucille Ferrand to join him in the conservatory. She arrived with the same dramatic grace she always had, a silk scarf tight around her throat, sunglasses despite the rain, cigarette in hand. But there was a stiffness now in her shoulders, as though each movement had to be rehearsed. Poirot greeted her with a polite nod. "Madame, would you sit?" She did. "There is something I must ask you directly," Poirot said, "and I trust you will respond with the honesty of one who has been in the theater long enough to know when the final act is at hand." Lucille arched a brow. "Monsieur Poirot, I've played every death scene imaginable. I know when a curtain is falling. Then you know, too, that Violene's curtain fell not by accident, but by design." A beat passed. Lucille exhaled. "So you believe I killed her?" "No," Poirot said softly. "I believe you feared her. But fear does not always lead to murder." She looked away. "We were close once. Before Sylvie. Afterward, everything changed." Poirot leaned forward. "Madame, I have a question that may seem strange. The night Violaine died, did you speak to her? Truly speak?" Lucille blinked, caught off guard. "Briefly, in her room. I brought her tea. We talked about the chapter she was struggling with. She was trembling. Kept the curtain drawn. And did she ask you to stay?" Lucille hesitated. "Yes." "But you left." "I did." Poirot was silent a moment. "She thought you would protect her." Lucille said nothing, and you, like so many before, stood still. After she left, Poirot called for Annabel Lee. She arrived holding a notebook, as though it might shield her from what she now suspected was coming. "I need to ask about the page you found," Poirot said. "You said it was hidden in your coat. Not placed by you." "That's right. You believe someone planted it." "I don't know. But I think someone wants me to be their mouthpiece." Poirot considered this. "Yes, that sounds very much like Violaine's style." He stood and crossed to the window. "I think she knew she would not live long enough to finish her story, and so she placed it in the hands of another, someone she knew would not destroy it, no matter the danger." Annabel's voice was barely a whisper. "She trusted me?" "She did." Poirot turned to her. "But someone else did not. Someone believed that silence was the only way to survive the past." By mid-afternoon, Poirot had one final conversation to initiate. He went to Remy Bardot's suite and found the man at his writing desk, staring at an untouched drink. Remy didn't look up when Poirot entered. "Do you know what it's like to wait for a secret to ruin you?" he asked. Poirot stepped inside. "Yes. But I also know what it's like to watch others suffer because of what you didn't say." Remy rubbed his temple. "I didn't kill her. You have to believe that." "I do," Poirot said. Remy's gaze darted to him, startled. "I believe you were too paralyzed by fear to act. That has been your pattern since Marseille." Remy stood abruptly. "Then who? Who do you think did it?" Poirot met his eyes. "I know." That evening, Poirot stood in the grand salon and summoned them all. Lucille, Remy, Annabel, Gilbert, the Countess. They arrived one by one, as if reporting for the end of a performance, the final curtain call none of them could avoid. The fire in the hearth crackled. Rain tapped gently at the windows. Poirot stood before them, hands clasped, eyes bright. "My friends," he said, "the time has come." He glanced at the far end of the room. Behind him, the velvet curtain remained drawn. "I have pieced together the last moments of Madame Chasseron. She feared for her life. Yes, but not because she imagined ghosts. She feared one of you. She had begun to tell her story, and in doing so she sealed her fate. Poirot paced slowly. She was given laudanum, not in food, not in wine, but in tea. And that tea was brought to her not by room service, but by the only one she trusted enough to receive it from, Lucille Ferrand. Lucille stiffened. That doesn't prove— Poirot raised a hand. You did not poison her, no. But you knew she was taking the drug. You knew she feared what might come. And you said nothing. He turned to Remy. You kept her chapters hidden, not to protect her, but yourself. The pact you made in Marseille could not survive the light. Poirot took a breath, but the murderer was not the one who feared the past. His voice dropped. It was the one who feared being erased by it. He turned slowly. Countess Elena Markova. A stunned silence. Markova's eyes narrowed. You overreach, monsieur. Do I? You were there the night Sylvie Marat died. You funded the theater. You silenced her death. And now, years later, Violaine prepared to expose you, not just as a patron, but as an architect of that cover-up. He stepped closer. You brought the vial of laudanum. You planted it inside the curtain's hem. You watched Violaine descend into sleep. And then, when she could no longer resist, you whispered to her, promised her peace, and watched her die behind velvet folds. Markova stood. This is absurd. But Poirot's voice was ice. You were the only one who never showed fear, because you believed no one would ever look at you. You had the resources, the reach, and you had done it before. The room was silent. Then Annabel spoke. She was whispering into the curtain, because someone was behind it. Poirot nodded. She thought she was safe, but the curtain had never protected her. It only hid the one who had been watching all along. Markova's hands trembled, and for the first time she said nothing, not a word. Poirot stepped back, the room heavy with revelation. Tomorrow the truth would be formalized. But tonight, in this salon of ghosts and velvet and lies, the curtain had finally risen on the truth. Chapter 13. A Desperate Attempt to Escape. The storm broke just after midnight. A sharp crack of thunder rolled over the hills of Provence, and for a moment the lights in Hotel Verité flickered, plunging the upper floors into a breathless dim. Outside, rain fell in cold, fast sheets, obscuring the driveway and hammering the balcony railings like 1,000 tiny fists. Poirot, still fully dressed, stood at his window in Suite 4A, watching the courtyard below. He was not surprised by what he saw. A figure, wrapped in a dark raincoat and clutching a leather travel bag, slipped through the west corridor doors and darted beneath the eaves, hugging the wall as she moved toward the staff gate. The motion was practiced, swift, determined. Countess Elena Markova. She was not the type to run, but now that her grand name had been spoken aloud beside the word murder, there was no stage left upon which she could remain still. Reputation was her true oxygen. Without it, there was no role to play. Poirot moved calmly to the hallway and knocked twice on Inspector Devoe's door. When the inspector emerged, bleary-eyed and confused, Poirot was already halfway down the corridor. "She is running," Poirot said without turning. "We must not let her vanish, as she did with Sylvie." The staff gate at the rear of the property led to a steep footpath, rarely used and poorly lit. It wound down through the vineyard terraces, then joined a gravel road used by local delivery vans. In fair weather, it was a scenic stroll. In this storm, it was a perilous descent. Markova moved quickly for a woman of her age, her steps precise even on the slick stones. The rain plastered her white hair to her face. She carried herself, not like someone afraid, but like someone who had already accepted exile and was determined to choose her own exile's terms. Poirot and Deveau followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. "I've sent a call ahead to the gendarmerie," Deveau muttered, breath catching. "But if she reaches the main road—" "She must not," Poirot said. "We must end this as we should have ended it 25 years ago." Markova reached the last bend of the path, where the vineyard gave way to open road. There, waiting beside a black town car with its engine already running, stood a driver in a flat cap, clearly on prearranged orders. She approached him swiftly, and then a beam of light caught her from behind. Poirot, holding Devoe's lantern, stepped from the shadows. "Countess," Poirot said, voice level, "there is nowhere to go." Markova froze, the travel bag still clutched in one hand. "You've made a mistake," she said. Poirot tilted his head. "The mistake was yours, madame. You should have trusted your silence to endure. But fear makes poor editors." She took a step forward. "You have no proof. I have the vial, the matchstick, the records of your conversation with Violaine from the hotel log, and now I have your flight, which, if nothing else, proves your guilt." The driver looked from Poirot to the Countess, startled. Deveau moved in behind her. "Madame Markova, please place the bag down." Markova's jaw tightened. She opened the bag slowly and withdrew something Poirot had not expected. A slim black folder. She held it out to him. "Her manuscript," she said. "The original. I took it before she died. She gave it to me willingly, out of loyalty." Poirot stepped forward, rain streaking down his brow. He opened the folder. Inside, the typewritten pages were unmarked, crisp, unread. "She trusted me," Markova said, voice low, "until the end, and still, she betrayed me." Poirot looked up. "You call it betrayal." But it was confession. She was tired of standing still. Markova's eyes glittered with something hard, something ancient. "I made her. There would be no Violaine Chasseron without me. And now," Poirot said, "there is only her memory. And your choice." She lowered her eyes. Deveau stepped forward and gently took her by the arm. No struggle, only silence. Back at the hotel, Poirot watched from the vestibule as the gendarmes escorted the Countess into the waiting car. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. Her umbrella snapped in the wind as if delivering one final bow. The guests did not emerge. But lights flickered behind curtains. Shadows moved in windows. The performance was over, but the audience still lingered. Poirot stood for a long time before turning away. The next morning dawned gray and still. In the breakfast room, the remaining guests took their coffee in uneasy quiet. Lucille sat beside Remy, not speaking. Gilbert Duvivier skimmed the paper but turned no pages. Annabelle sat alone, a single croissant untouched on her plate. Poirot entered last. They looked up as he passed. He nodded once. It was not triumph he wore, but gravity. He joined Annabelle at her table. "I believe," he said softly, "that Violaine's story should still be told. Perhaps not as she intended. Perhaps not with names. But the truth, Mademoiselle Lee, it must not remain behind velvet." Annabelle nodded. "I'll write it, as it was, without invention, without flattery." Poirot smiled faintly. "Even better." He rose and left her there with her notebook and her silence. Later that afternoon, Poirot stood once more in Suite 6B. The curtain had been drawn back now, the room aired, the glass of water gone, the bed freshly made. But something of Violaine remained, a presence not ghostly but resolute. She had not screamed. She had whispered. And at last, someone had listened. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. 2 days had passed since Countess Elena Markova's arrest. The air at Hotel Verité, though seemingly lighter, still carried the echoes of everything unspoken. The guests, those who remained, had grown oddly polite in their unease, like performers lingering backstage after a show whose audience had long departed. Poirot, however, had not yet taken his bow. For though the confession was complete in the eyes of the law, and the physical evidence sufficient to secure the Countess's fate, something still pressed against the edges of Poirot's formidable mind. A detail, a silence that did not match the others. And on this gray morning, as he sat before the remains of his breakfast, a memory returned, not of the case, but of a gesture, the curtain. Not just where Violaine had died, not just the theatrical metaphor it had become, but a physical act, the curtain drawn closed by someone after her death. He had assumed it had been the killer, a symbolic gesture, or perhaps an unconscious reflex, but now something about it tugged at him. Poirot rose swiftly and made his way, for what must have been the 7th time, to Suite 6B. The room had been cleaned, but not reassigned. Out of respect, the hotel director had said. But Poirot suspected fear was the truer reason. He entered silently, closing the door behind him. The curtain, once again swayed gently, open this time, harmless. Poirot stood before it, then slowly began to close it, not out of ceremony, but observation. It was heavier on one side. He reached for the seam, the same one from which he'd once retrieved the laudanum vial, and then he felt it. Not another pocket, not glass. A crease. Poirot froze. He unhooked the curtain from its runner and pulled it free from the pole, folding it carefully over the chaise. His fingers followed the line of stitching down the inner hem. There, about halfway down, hidden between the layers of fabric, was a strip of paper, small, discolored, and hastily torn. He extracted it gently. A note, in Violaine's handwriting. Faint, smudged by time and the weight of velvet. If I am found behind the curtain, do not believe it was sleep. I was waiting for someone. And someone came. Poirot's heart thudded once. This was the true final act. Back in his room, Poirot laid the note beside the now infamous page Annabel had discovered in her coat sleeve. He reread both in silence. They did not contradict. They completed each other. Violaine had not merely feared exposure of the past. She had orchestrated a confrontation with someone she believed still might protect her. She had asked to be met behind the curtain, and someone had come, not with poison or violence, but with inaction. Poirot stood before the mirror and straightened his cuffs. There would be no arrest today, no final monologue, but there would be a reckoning. He found Lucille Ferrand on the balcony terrace, seated beneath an umbrella, a fresh martini before her, and a silk scarf fluttering at her collarbone. She saw him coming and did not stand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you look grave. Shall I prepare myself for another round of accusations?" "No, madame," Poirot said gently, taking the seat opposite her. "There will be no accusations." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" "Understanding." Lucille said nothing. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the hidden note. Her eyes dropped to it. "I found it stitched into the curtain lining this morning," Poirot said. "It was not meant to be seen, unless things went wrong." She did not reach for the note. "She was waiting for you, wasn't she?" Poirot asked. Lucille's hands tightened slightly around her glass. "I think," Poirot continued, Violaine wanted absolution from the one person she believed still loved her. Lucille turned away. She asked you to come that night. Not to kill her, not to help her flee, just to stand with her behind the curtain, so she wouldn't be alone when she finally told the truth. A silence fell between them. Then, she whispered. Lucille said, her voice low. She said, "Will you stay?" "And you left," Poirot said softly. Lucille looked out over the wet vineyard. "I couldn't. I saw her take the tea. I knew she had drugged herself. I was afraid it was a performance, that she wanted me to stop her, or witness it. And I couldn't do either. I just walked out." Poirot said nothing. "She died, thinking I abandoned her," Lucille whispered. Poirot nodded slowly. "She did not name you, not in her final pages. She left you out. That is perhaps her final act of love." Lucille gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Some curtain call." Poirot stood. "She did not need you to save her," he said. "Only to stay." He left her with the note. That evening, Poirot took one final walk through the gardens. The vines glistened from the earlier rain. The peacocks had returned to their perch. The piano in the drawing-room had begun to play again, uncertain but present. Poirot closed his notebook for the last time. The case was not only solved, it was understood. Justice, in its cold legal form, had been served. But so too had something quieter. The truth behind the curtain, where guilt had waited in silence for a quarter-century. Violaine Chasseron was gone, but her voice, at last, had been heard. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The rain had passed. In its place, a soft mistral blew through the grounds of Hotel Verité, rustling the lavender hedges and cooling the heavy air left behind by recent revelations. The hotel's staff resumed their routines with a touch more urgency, as if efficiency might ward off the lingering discomfort that still shadowed the halls. Guests moved more quietly now, more thoughtfully. The scent of citrus trees had returned to the breeze, but none among them could yet call it peace. At noon, sharp, Hercule Poirot summoned the remaining members of the guest circle to the winter salon, a rarely used room lined with tapestries of antique coastal scenes. The fire crackled low in the hearth, though the day was warm, and the arrangement of chairs, symmetrical, direct, left no room for ambiguity. They came as called. Lucille Ferrand, scarf pulled tight around her neck, her gaze distant but composed. Remy Bardot, his complexion pale, his eyes ringed with fatigue. Gilbert Duvivier, who carried himself as though in a courtroom, yet said nothing. Annabel Lee, notebook clutched tightly to her chest, her movements careful, quiet. Each took a seat. Poirot stood before them with his hands lightly clasped behind his back, immaculate in a three-piece gray suit and a tie of somber burgundy. He did not raise his voice, nor did he pace. He simply began, as though reading the final paragraph of a manuscript already written. "Madame Chasseron is no longer among us," he said. "But her voice remains, and it is that voice I have chosen to echo today, not with vengeance, but with truth." The guests did not stir. They knew now that interruption would not change what was coming. Poirot continued. "We are all shaped by the past, but some of us are trapped by it. Violaine was such a person. Her beauty, her talent, even her cruelty, these were not shields. They were symptoms. She bore the weight of something hidden, something she believed had stained her forever." He paused, then looked at Remy. "The pact you made in Marseille. It was meant to protect reputations, but what it truly preserved was guilt." Remy nodded, almost imperceptibly. Poirot turned to Gilbert. "You did not kill Sylvie Marat, but you helped bury the truth. And Violaine, all these years later, could no longer carry your silence." Then to Lucille. "You were asked to stay, and you left." Lucille blinked once, that was all. Finally, Poirot looked to Annabel. "You became her final witness." Not to what she did, but to what she tried to do. She wanted to reveal everything, even knowing it might destroy her. And in you, she found someone who would listen. Annabel's grip on the notebook tightened. Poirot unfolded a single page, Violaine's note retrieved from the curtain. He read it aloud. "If I am found behind the curtain, do not believe it was sleep. I was waiting for someone, and someone came." The silence that followed was heavy, with breath unspoken. Poirot lowered the page. "We speak often of justice, but rarely do we speak of regret. Yet it is regret, not revenge, that has poisoned this circle more than any laudanum ever could." He looked to Lucille. "Madame, you did not kill her, but your silence helped her die." Lucille closed her eyes. "I know." Poirot nodded once. He stepped back and let the silence stand for a moment longer. Then, "This is not a court. There is no sentencing. There's only acknowledgement." No one answered. No one denied. The fire cracked in the hearth. Poirot reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a thin stack of pages, Annabel's retyped manuscript, the cleaned, coherent version of Violaine's last confessions. The names had been changed, the locations obscured, but the truth remained beneath every word. He set the stack on the table in the center of the circle. "Let her story be told," he said, "not to punish the living, but to release the dead." Later, when the guests had returned to their rooms, some to pack, others simply to reflect, Poirot remained in the winter salon, staring into the low-burning fire. The quiet there was not oppressive, but solemn, restorative. Inspector Deveau joined him not long after, a manila envelope under one arm. "It's done," Deveau said. "Markova will stand trial. I've submitted your full report to the judiciary. They'll have no trouble securing a conviction." Poirot gave a slight nod but did not smile. "You don't seem satisfied," Deveau added. "I am not a man who revels in punishment," Poirot said, "only in clarity. And you have it now." Poirot glanced down at the flames. "Oui, but clarity is a strange companion. It comforts, but never embraces." Deveau took a seat beside him. "You believe the others should be charged?" "No," Poirot said quietly. "They've sentenced themselves already." That evening, as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Poirot took one final walk through the grounds of Hotel Verité. The lavender trembled in the breeze. The shutters were drawn on Suite 6B, and above, the stars began to prick the sky like tiny judgmental eyes. But Poirot was at peace. The truth, after all, had stepped out from behind the curtain. It had not needed to shout. It had only whispered. And now, finally, someone had listened. Chapter 16. The Reveal. It was a rare morning of clarity in Aix-en-Provence. Sunlight poured cleanly through the tall windows of Hotel Verité, catching on the whitewashed stone, chasing away the rain of previous days. Yet the atmosphere inside the salon was anything but light. Though the crime had already been answered with an arrest, and the secrets of the past laid bare, Poirot had not yet delivered his final analysis. And those who remained knew it. The suspects, no longer suspects in the eyes of the law but still bound together by guilt and memory, had been invited to one final gathering in the Grand Salon. No police, no judge, no press. Only Poirot, his notebook, and the puzzle's last piece. They arrived one by one, subdued by the weight of recent days. Lucille Ferrand was dressed in black, her lips painted red as ever, but her eyes seemed smaller, as though retreating. Remy Bardot looked as though he had not slept at all. A man who had spent his life managing assets now faced a truth he could neither quantify nor write off. Gilbert Duvivier walked slowly, without his usual theatrical gait. He kept his gaze on the floor. And Annabel Lee, calm but pale, still carried the manuscript with her, not clutched this time, but carried respectfully, like an heirloom. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his back to the flames, the velvet curtains framing the windows behind him like the wings of a theater stage. He waited until all were seated. Then he began. "Mes amis," he said, folding his hands gently, "we have come to the end, not only of an investigation, but of a performance that began many years ago." He took a few steps forward, eyes landing on each of them. "I have not gathered you to restate what you already know. That Madame Chasseron died because of a sedative placed in her tea. That Countess Elena Markova feared exposure and manipulated Violaine into self-inflicted silence. That a tragic death in a dressing room decades ago was hidden by 5 people who chose silence over justice." He paused. "But what has not yet been said aloud is how Violaine came to orchestrate her final scene, why she chose that moment, why she invited Lucille, why she positioned herself behind the curtain." He held up a small envelope. Inside it was Violaine's final handwritten note, the one found sewn into the curtain. "If I am found behind the curtain, do not believe it was sleep. I was waiting for someone, and someone came." Poirot met Lucille's eyes. "She was waiting for you, madame. She believed, foolishly or not, that you might still care enough to witness her final reckoning. Not to save her, but to see her, to stay." Lucille looked away. Her fingers twisted the edge of her scarf. Poirot turned next to Remy Bardot. "You, monsieur, feared the book, feared what it could expose. But you did not kill her. Your sin was omission. She handed you truth, and you hid it in a drawer. You silenced her voice, yet she wrote around you anyway." Remy didn't speak. His shoulders sagged further. Poirot continued, "And you, Monsieur Duvivier? Your crime was vanity. You feared not scandal, but humiliation. That the world would discover the man behind the patron's mask was weak, and so you encouraged her to delay, to fictionalize, to dilute the truth." Gilbert flinched, but did not deny it. "And yet," Poirot said softly, "Violaine forgave all of you. Even Markova, in her way. She refused to name you outright. She protected you, even as she exposed herself." He turned to Annabel. "She left you her voice, and with it the burden of truth." Annabel nodded. "I know." Poirot stepped back, the room now utterly silent but for the soft creak of the fire. "There is something else," he said, "a final contradiction." They leaned forward, almost involuntarily. Poirot opened his notebook to a dog-eared page. Countess Markova insisted that Violaine never gave her the final manuscript, that she stole it. But the handwritten pages recovered from Markova's bag were not all in Violaine's hand. He looked to Lucille. "One note, buried among the typewritten pages, was yours." Lucille's face drained of color. Poirot continued gently. It was a letter of apology, short but unmistakable, dated the night of Violaine's death, folded among her final draft, which means you returned. Lucille's lips parted. "You came back," Poirot said. "After the sedative had begun its work, you found her dazed. You sat behind the curtain with her, and she whispered, 'Will you stay?' Lucille's voice trembled. She asked me not to leave, and I didn't. I stayed until she closed her eyes. Poirot stepped closer, and you thought, perhaps, that you had not done enough, that your presence, your silence, was as good as complicity. So you told no one. You took the manuscript, hid the letter. You believed you had failed her. Lucille's mascara had begun to smudge beneath her eyes. But Madame, Poirot said softly, she died with someone beside her. And though you did not stop the past, you stayed for its end. That, too, is a kind of mercy. Lucille bowed her head. Poirot placed the notebook on the mantel. There will be no further accusations, no arrests, no trials. He looked around the room one last time, but the truth has been named. And for Violaine Chasseron, that is enough. He nodded, and with that he turned and left the room. The silence held long after Poirot had gone. Finally, Remy rose. Gilbert followed. Lucille lingered, and Annabel, still seated, opened the manuscript once more and began to read from the beginning, not for others, not for the world, but for Violaine. Behind the curtain, her voice had never reached the audience, but now, finally, it would. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Autumn had arrived at last. The vineyards surrounding Hôtel Vérité turned a muted gold, their leaves curling like pages at the edge of a forgotten book. A hush had settled over the estate, not the silence of suspense, but the quiet that follows resolution, when the final note of a song has been played, and all that remains is its lingering echo. Inside, Hercule Poirot packed his belongings with his usual fastidious care. His valise was modest, yet every item within it was placed with such precision that even the most seasoned hotel valet would hesitate to assist. He folded his tie-pin into a velvet pouch and reached for his gloves before pausing at the writing desk. There, resting neatly beside a glass of water, was a small envelope left for him by Annabel Lee. He opened it carefully. Inside were two things. The first, a short note, handwritten in graceful, precise script. The book is finished, but I will not publish it as memoir. Only as fiction. She deserves peace, not legacy. The second item was a single page from Violaine Chasseron's original manuscript. Not one of drama or confession, but something else entirely. A short, wistful piece about her first performance. How she had forgotten her lines, how she had improvised her way back, and how the applause that night felt warmer than anything that ever followed. Poirot smiled faintly. So this was the ending Violaine had truly wanted. Not scandal, but memory. Not fire, but reflection. He placed the page gently in his inner coat pocket. Downstairs, the hotel's remaining guests were departing in quiet succession. Gilbert Duvivier had already left that morning, his luggage collected by a sleek black car bound for Paris. He did not say goodbye. He had returned to the capital, it was said, to resume his work at the Ministry of Culture. But those who knew him suspected he might take early retirement, out of shame, or perhaps, for the first time in his life, reflection. Rémy Bardot lingered by the breakfast table longer than usual. His usual arrogance was gone. He nodded politely to Poirot, then to Annabel, then disappeared down the corridor without a word. Lucille Ferrand, dressed in navy blue, appeared at Poirot's shoulder just as he stepped into the main corridor. "I thought I might never leave this place," she said, her voice low. Poirot turned. "And now you do." Lucille looked out through the arched window at the gardens where the lavender had begun to wilt. "Do you believe in redemption, monsieur?" Poirot gave a gentle nod, but not in the theater sense, not a final dramatic act that erases all before it. "I believe in quiet redemption, a letter not sent, a page not burned, a moment when one stays despite fear. She smiled faintly. "I did love her, you know," Lucille said. "I know," Poirot replied. And so did she. They parted without ceremony. The most surprising change came in Annabel Lee. She remained at the hotel one day longer than the others, seated often beneath the olive trees, rewriting the final chapter by hand. When Poirot found her there in the late afternoon, she looked up and offered him a seat beside her. "I've decided on a new title," she said. Poirot smiled. "Ah? And what shall it be?" "The Curtain She Whispered Into." Poirot's brows lifted with approval. "Poetic," he said, "and precise." "It won't sell like a scandal," Annabel admitted, "but perhaps it will last longer." Poirot leaned back, gazing at the soft, rustling leaves overhead. Stories that whisper often stay longer in the mind than those that scream. She handed him the final page. It read, "She whispered not for drama, but for mercy, not to be remembered, but to be seen. And so we leave her not as a tragic figure, but as a woman who wanted to tell the truth, even when it broke her." Poirot closed his eyes. That evening, just before his departure, Poirot stood once more in Suite 6B. The room had been stripped of its drama. The curtain had been replaced. The air cleared of perfume. And yet something lingered, not haunting, but gentle, like the presence of someone who had finally been understood. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the last of the sunlight drip down the walls. Then he said aloud, "To no one, 'Justice has been served, madame.' Not the kind they measure in courts, but the kind measured in memory." He touched the lapel of his coat where Violene's note now rested. "Au revoir." As the train pulled away from the small station at Aix-en-Provence, Poirot sat alone in his compartment, hands resting lightly on his knees. He was not smiling, nor frowning, only thinking. For once, it was not a crime that consumed his mind, but something rarer, regret, remorse. And how? When spoken with sincerity, these could form a kind of justice all their own. Back at the hotel, long after Poirot's departure, the staff unlocked the library cabinet for the first time in weeks. On a polished walnut shelf between volumes of old plays and faded poetry, a new book was quietly placed, a single copy, titled "The Curtain She Whispered Into" by Annabel Lee, dedicated to the woman who whispered. "I heard you," Chapter 18, the closing remark. Weeks had passed. The chill of early winter had crept over Paris, dusting the rooftops in a fine frost and breathing fog into the windows of cafes and bookstores. But at 31 Rue des Martyrs, the apartment of Monsieur Hercule Poirot remained as precisely ordered as ever, unmoved by weather, time, or the fickle disarray of the world outside. It was a quiet afternoon. Poirot sat in his armchair by the fireplace, a blanket folded crisply over his knees, and a pot of thick hot chocolate steaming on the side table beside him. The radio played softly, a violin sonata he particularly enjoyed, and in his lap a single book rested. The Curtain She Whispered Into. Its spine was modest, its dust jacket understated. No photograph, no blurb, just a pale gray cover with black lettering, and beneath it a dedication to the woman who chose to tell the truth, even when no one asked for it. He turned the final page again, slowly, savoring it. Though he already knew the story by heart, though he had lived its unraveling in the quiet halls of Hotel Verité, Annabel Lee's telling gave it a new rhythm. Her prose did not dramatize, nor did it condemn. It observed, it remembered, and in doing so, it gave back something Violaine had once believed lost: dignity. He set the book down gently. There was a knock at the door. Poirot did not startle. He had been expecting it. "Entrez," he called, rising slowly. His housekeeper opened the door, ushering in a visitor who carried herself with the unease of someone returning to a place they had once fled. Lucille Ferrand entered wearing a navy coat and gloves, her hat in hand. She had aged, just slightly, in the weeks since Poirot had seen her last. Or perhaps it was not age, but the surrender of a mask too long worn. "Merci for receiving me," she said. Poirot bowed. "Always, madame." She sat by the fire. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lucille gestured toward the book on the side table. "She sent me a copy," she said. "Annabelle." Poirot nodded. "And you read it?" "I did." "And?" Lucille inhaled slowly. It's not how Violaine would have told it, but it's what she wanted remembered. Not the fall, but the pause before. Poirot folded his hands. She did not want to be exonerated, you know. She only wanted to be seen. Lucille looked into the flames. She was always afraid of vanishing, she said, even as a girl. She thought if no one remembered you, you died twice. Poirot was silent. Lucille turned to him. "Did she forgive me?" Poirot rose, walked to a small drawer beneath his writing desk, and retrieved something wrapped in linen. He handed it to her. Lucille unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small, tarnished gold earring. Her breath caught. She held it in her hand at the end, Poirot said. Perhaps by accident. But I choose to believe she meant to leave it behind, for you. Lucille blinked quickly, brushing her sleeve across her cheek. Poirot returned to his chair and spoke gently. "You asked me once if I believed in redemption. I do, but it is rarely given. It is chosen." Lucille closed her fingers around the earring. "And have I chosen it?" Poirot gave a slight smile. "You stayed." After she left, Poirot remained by the window, watching the twilight descend upon Paris. Lights came on in nearby flats. A tram passed in the distance. Somewhere a child was laughing. He picked up the book once more and opened it to a random page. There, a single line stood out. Violaine's words filtered through Annabelle's pen. "We perform not for the stage, but for the gaze of someone who might stay long enough to understand us." Poirot closed the book. For all its deception, violence, and guilt, the affair at Hotel Verité had not been a story of cruelty, but of longing. The longing to be seen, heard, known. He looked into the fire, eyes reflecting the orange light. And then, softly, he said, "Ah, but human nature, it is the most intricate puzzle of all." And with that, Hercule Poirot, Belgium's most brilliant detective and perhaps its most understanding soul, folded his hands over his lap, leaned back into his chair, and allowed the curtain to fall. But the story was not quite finished. Not entirely. That evening, as twilight slid like smoke across the rooftops of Paris, Poirot poured himself a second cup of chocolate and placed the book once more upon his lap. The pages had cooled. The truth had been told. Yet a strange sensation lingered in his chest. Une hesitation, like the final note of a piano piece that hadn't resolved. He stared at the dedication page again, to the woman who chose to tell the truth, even when no one asked for it. There was something in the phrasing that troubled him, even when no one asked for it. Not when everyone wanted the truth, not when justice demanded it, but even when no one asked. Why, Poirot wondered, would a woman risk everything to reveal a truth no one wanted to hear? Unless she knew, someone needed it. He opened his notebook, where the evidence from the case still lived in delicate sketches of timelines and floor plans. At the bottom of the final page was a detail so faint, so nearly dismissed, that it now rose to meet him like a whisper from the curtain itself. The note stitched into the hem. He remembered it clearly, Violene's desperate scrawl, "If I am found behind the curtain, do not believe it was sleep. I was waiting for someone, and someone came." He had assumed, then confirmed, that it was Lucille. Lucille had admitted it, wept for it, and yet... Poirot flipped back 2 pages. There had been a second note, recovered not from Violene's curtain, but from Remy Bardot's drawer, the red leather folder hidden in Suite 5D. A torn page, a line at the bottom, "I know who didn't push her, and I know who stood still." That line had haunted him then, and it haunted him now. Not because of what it said, but because of how it was written. The handwriting had not matched Violene's. Poirot had assumed it was an insertion by Annabel, or perhaps an annotation from Remy. But what if it had been neither? The next morning, Poirot placed a call to the publisher whose name appeared in Annabel Lee's professional correspondence, the very one to whom she claimed she'd submitted the curtain she whispered into. He asked only one question. "Tell me, Monsieur, when did Mademoiselle Lee send you her final manuscript?" The reply was swift. "More than 2 weeks before the arrest, Monsieur Poirot. The draft arrived in full, by registered post, on the 26th of last month." Poirot's brow furrowed. That was before the murder. He replaced the receiver, his mind sharpening. So, Annabel Lee, the quiet ghostwriter, had submitted the final version of the manuscript before Violaine died. And yet, it included events that had not occurred until after her death. The whisper behind the curtain, the tea, the vial, the missing chapter, which meant she had known. That afternoon, Poirot requested one final audience with Mademoiselle Lee. They met at a café near the Seine. A cold wind rustled the edges of her scarf. She was dressed in soft earth tones and carried a leather-bound journal, which she placed carefully on the table. Poirot didn't touch his drink. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "I must ask you something unusual." She tilted her head. "You were the first person to read Violaine's final pages. The only person, perhaps, who saw her not as a fading star or a threat, but as a woman afraid. Yes?" Annabel nodded. "I respected her, even when I didn't like her." "And you claim," Poirot said carefully, "that you found the final chapter in your coat sleeve, that it had been placed there after her death." "Yes," she said, brows knitting. "I was as surprised as you." Poirot leaned in, lowering his voice. "Mademoiselle Lee, the publisher received your manuscript on the 26th, but Violaine died on the 29th, and yet the manuscript contains scenes that happened after her death." She went very still. Her fingers tightened on the leather journal. "Perhaps," she said softly, "she gave me the pages earlier, and I chose not to tell anyone." Poirot shook his head. "No, you anticipated too much, too precisely. The chapter about the curtain, it was not guesswork. It was crafted." He let the silence stretch, then said the final words. "You didn't just write the memoir, did you? You finished it." Annabel's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Would you have let me, if I had asked?" Poirot said nothing. She looked out over the river. "She was broken, Monsieur Poirot. She came to me not to confess, but to relieve herself. And in doing so, she placed her whole story into my hands. She was afraid of the consequences, but she wanted someone to make sense of it, even if she couldn't." Poirot nodded slowly. So you rewrote the ending. I softened it, Annabel admitted. I gave her grace. I gave her the whisper. Poirot closed his eyes. Not a murder, then. Not an accident. But an author's choice. Crafted posthumously. By someone who understood that Violane's voice had always been theatrical, but her pain was very real. As they parted outside the cafe, Annabel handed him the leather journal. I don't need it anymore, she said. Poirot waited until she had disappeared into the crowd before opening it. On the inside flap was a line in her handwriting, the same delicate script as before. Stories lie, but endings, if written well, can tell the truth. Poirot smiled, not in amusement, in acknowledgement. The mystery had ended, but the story, like all great stories, had merely changed its form. It had stopped being a case and become, at last, a legacy. Fin.